Hi, this is Yanina from Ukraine, and today I want to give you 5 perspectives for better understanding the Russian war against Ukraine. That's not so easy to figure out if you're not from Ukraine. 5 levels of Russian war against Ukraine, explained. So, Russia versus Ukraine. What is this war about? What are its deep reasons? And what's at stake for the world? I will begin with stakes for Ukraine and then goes what it could bring for region and for the world. But first, please subscribe to this channel, ring the bell and don't forget to put a thumb up under this video if you like it. Level 1. Empire against independent country. Let's begin with more obvious perspective. Ukraine for a long time was under Russian rule, and it brought so much damage to Ukrainians, such as genocide and repression of Ukrainian culture and language. Every 24 August for last 30 years, Ukraine celebrates the Independence Day. But today, instead of focusing on developing our country after devastating decades of Soviet regime, we have to fight for our right to exist as a country and even as a nation. No, not only because of the sick ambition of one man, Vladimir Putin, as many things, but because of the true nature of Russian state itself. Russia never stopped being and still is an empire. It consists of many once conquered lands. Now there are 83 subjects of the Russian Federation, of which 21 are national republics, and all of them don't have any real self-government. But still, Russia has an even bigger ambition: to occupy its previous colony. In a way, this war is an unfinished historical process after the collapse of the USSR. So for Ukraine, it's basically a post-colonial war for our independence. Ironically, 30 years later after legally getting independence. And this applies not only to war on the battlefield, but also to getting rid of post-colonial consequences, such as cultural repression, Russification, economic and political problems. By the way, if you want to know more about post-colonialism in Ukraine, check out my other video on this channel. What's at stake? The existence of Ukrainian state itself is on the stake. The opportunities for Ukrainians to develop our country and to choose our own future. And the strong possibility of new full-scale genocide of Ukrainians. That is already on, especially considering what have happened in Mariupol or Bucha, but the more cities Russia occupies, the worse it could become. So the angle number 2 to understand how serious this war is: the war for existence, and only one will survive. This war shows that it's a case of do or die. It's either independent Ukraine or Imperial Russia. Success of the one means destruction of the other. First, let's look at it from the Russian perspective. As I pointed out before, Russia is a classic old-time empire that has to extend. Among the creators of Russian fascism, there is a widespread idea that Russia is not just a country, it has to be a separate Eurasian civilization, the core of which is the Russian nation, and which is in opposition to Europe and to the entire West world. Without control over Ukraine, Russia will not be able to become a full-fledged empire. It's because of some practical reasons like access to the Black Sea or an increase its territory in Europe, but it has even stronger ideological reasons. In his 2021 article about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin declared that Ukrainians are one nation with Russians, only corrupted by the Ukrainian language, history and culture. In this ideology, Ukrainians presented as anti-Russia, an antipode nations to Russians. The Russian president directly writes that he cannot allow the existence of anti-Russia on his borders. One of the most influential far-right theorist of idea of Russia as a center of Eurasian civilization, Alexander Dugin, argued that Ukraine should be annexed by Russia because, quote, Ukraine as an independent state with some territorial ambition represent a huge danger for the whole of Eurasia, and without a solution to the Ukrainian problem, it is pointless to talk about continental geopolitics at all. What's at stake? Even if this war will stop and Ukraine will take back all the occupied territories, there is still big threat for Ukraine from Russia. Ukraine will not be able to feel safe as long as this neighboring country continues to exist as an empire. If Russia wins Ukraine, that means it's strong enough to keep invading other former colonies, maybe after a pause to catch a break. But if they have enough power and money, they won't stop until reborn of their country in Soviet borders, or at least something close enough to that. Final resolving of this conflict for all Eastern Europe requires a dramatic change of Russian state. And it leads us to perspective number 3. Good old fascism against young democracy. Both Russia and Ukraine were in totalitarian Soviet Union, but for the last 30 years, two political systems moved in the opposite direction. By the way, you can find more about differences in Rethinking Soviet Past by Ukraine and Russia in a separate video on this channel. Modern Russia has all the main features of a fascist state. Quote of Yale University professor and the author of books of fascism, Timothy Snyder. A time traveler from the 1930s would have no difficulty to identify the Putin regime as fascist. The symbol Z, the rallies, the propaganda, the war as a cleansing act of violence, and the death pits around Ukrainian towns make it all very plain. So now it's fascist, authoritarian Putin's Russia with super centralized and oppressive government system and the chauvinistic ideology on the one side against very chaotic by rapid Ukrainian democracy that has unsettled political institutions but fast developing civil society. And this difference between two countries is actually another reason for Russia invasion. Neighboring democratic Ukraine, where the political power is constantly changing, both through election and through two revolutions, is a direct threat to the stable Putin's regime, which has existed for more than 20 years. What's at stake? Depending on what political system will win, it probably will determine the future of the region. Are democratic changes real in Belarus and Russia itself? And will the region be able to become stable? And outcomes of this war will have a significant impact on the world. If Russia wins, it would give an example for other undemocratic regimes to begin to strengthen and raise their heads. That leads us to the next level on conflict number 4. Russia against the global security system. By launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia demonstrated the old rules of security in the world just don't work anymore. A few weeks before the full-scale war began, famous historian and philosopher Yuval Harari wrote the article where he argued that Russian threat to invade Ukraine should concern every person on Earth. He emphasized that after the World War II, not a single internationally recognized country has been completely wiped off the map by external conquest. If it again became normative for powerful countries to wolf down their weaker neighbors, it would affect the way people all over the world feel and behave. Harari talked about returning to the law of the jungle instead of a collective security system. Russia already invaded Ukraine, so we're kind of in the middle of the development of events described by Harari. But Russian ambitious plan to conquer Ukraine in 3 days failed dramatically, despite many Western experts have such a forecast. Ukraine was underestimated before, but it turned out to be stronger than it seemed. It's only a matter of what resources Russia will have, how strong resistant Ukraine will put up, and whether the allied countries will provide us the sufficient assistance. What's at stake? If Russia wins this war, I mean annexation of more territories of Ukraine or even destruction of Ukraine as a sovereign state, it will open doors for other authoritarian countries to act similar. First thought in mind is China and possible attack on Taiwan. New geopolitical rules, or even worse, no rules at all, but the law of the jungle. So finally, let's look on Russian-Ukrainian war from geopolitical angle. Global confrontation, called informational war or Third World War. I have already mentioned that the Russian ideology asserts a separate Russian or Eurasian civilization that opposed itself to the global West. In fact, the West actually means all developed democracies, for example, including Japan or South Korea, and of course NATO, but the role of NATO is deliberately exaggerated and demonized by Russian propaganda. However, this is a topic for a separate video. Russia seeks to represent an alternative to the so-called West and at the same time counts among its allies such countries as India and China. In this way, a picture of the bipolar world familiar since the Cold War is created. Russia, of course, exaggerated its role in this confrontation. After all, if we can talk about a bipolar world, then its main superpowers can be only the USA and China. I would like to hope that China will continue on a rational path of economic cooperation with the democratic world. But we see that the relationship between the democratic and authoritarian parts of the world is currently getting worse. Although Russia is not such a powerful country, its role in the global informational war is quite significant. Russia is working to destabilize democratic process in the world. Russia supports anti-democratic and radical political movements. For decades, Russia openly or secretly supports authoritarian rulers all over the world, from Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela to Assad in Syria. Also, they are supporting far-right and far-left political parties, especially actively they do it in Europe. Russians actively use social networks and so-called troll farms to interfere in political processes in other countries. For example, USA elections. Professional Russian trolls focus on fanning Americans' emotions around hated topics such as gun control, immigration, or Black Lives Matter movement. Now, Russian propaganda is actively operating all over the world, spreading pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian and anti-Western ideas. Another time, it's hard for me to figure out, is it a particular comment on Facebook post is from a troll or from a real person who believes in those ideas and may not even realize it's actually Russian propaganda. The full-scale invasion in Ukraine was a huge step which revealed the true nature of Russia. Even it was pretty obvious before. And of course, because of Russian nuclear blackmail, threats to use nuclear weapons as an argument, the world already on a slippery slope. What's at stake? I don't want to be dramatic and say something like it's the existence of humanity at stake. Still, I hope it won't get there. But what we are going to see is that as global confrontation becomes more intense, it would be a real threat to global cooperation of problems, such as preventing catastrophic climate change or possible pandemics. And we already see how Russia's war against Ukraine affects food security. So my point is, there are not good scenarios if Russia wins this war. We have to stop Russia as soon as possible. Thank you for watching and stand up with Ukraine.